Hello, everyone. My name is Heather Kinzie. Welcome to our webinar. I am the Chief Operating Officer with the Strive Group, and today's session is on performance management with remote workers. A little bit of housekeeping, for lack of a better phrase, about the session today. This is the first in a series of performance management topics. I'll cover the next two early next week. You can visit thestrivegroup.com if you want to look to see what our future programming is, or if you'd like access to previously recorded sessions. If you're joining us live today, you'll notice that there's a chat function on the right-hand side of your screen. This session is being moderated by Marshall Watson, and he will take your observations or your questions, and I will address those as we get towards the end of the session. So right before 11 o'clock, I'll start to look at what he's been sending me from you. I'll try not to go over. I have a tendency to ramble, especially on topics that I love, and this is one of them. So I have a tendency to go long, but I'll try not to do that today so I can address all the questions that come in. So without further ado, let's jump into the topic. The topic is performance management, but I think it's important for us to realize just what that means. And from my perspective, performance management is an ongoing dialogue of a whole host of things. It starts with you telling what tasks and roles are expected to be accomplished. It goes into, or it evolves into, what standards of performance you're expecting regarding those tasks and those roles and responsibilities. Then it goes into, or it evolves into, how we're going to monitor and measure your success. And then, of course, it's an analysis of what we're getting, what we're seeing, or what we're hearing about regarding those standards. And from there, we make a determination on if the employee is doing well, if the employee is doing moderately, if the employee is not doing well enough, right? So a lot of analysis and thinking goes into that, which then, of course, evolves into, do we need to continue to enable that type of performance to happen? Do we need to develop a different type of performance? Do we need to correct that performance in order to get the improvement that we need, or the actual standard that we were expecting? And all of that comes through, obviously, feedback and communication with the employee. So as you can see, there's a lot that comes into this. And it's more than just, here's what I expect you to do, and a year later or 90 days later, here's what I thought about that, right? So it is an ongoing dialogue. And that certainly does not change simply because we have a remote workforce. And so the process of performance management is fairly simple. I've never been the type of consultant or manager to overcomplicate things. And so I break it down into a 5-step process. Now, there is a caveat here. I kind of cheat in that bullet there that's labeled options. But with the exception of my cheat in that bubble, it's a pretty simplistic process. It starts with identifying expectations. It moves on to identifying what the standards of performance should be, how you're going to monitor and measure that standard or that performance against that standard. Then we have sort of my cheat bucket or my cheat bubble. And then after we get out of that bubble, because there's a lot to unpack in that bubble, then it's simply a recognition and a feedback step of the process. And so let's dive into those first 3 in today's webinar. All right. So job or task expectations. In the regular world, right, before you introduced remote work into your environment, we had a variety of ways that we communicated what role was going to be delegated, or what task was expected to be performed, or what overall responsibility I was going to leave any given employee to do on any given week, right? So this is what task is being done, who I expect to do it or to take care of it or to be overly responsible for it. And then hopefully we interjected some why this task is being performed, or why I expect this task to be performed in the first place, right? So previous to the remote work situation that you may find yourself in today, we did this a variety of ways, or the mediums that we articulated these things were varied, right? We had job descriptions, we had checklists. Some of us had policies and protocols or desk manuals even outlined for these staff, right? Here is what this job entails, right? We had meetings to help clarify some of these things, or to otherwise provide some specificity into, a job description or a desk manual or a regulation. Here's what we're in charge of, or a contract, right? Some of us are very contract or project driven. So we had meetings to help clarify or specify those. Now that we're in a remote work situation, the big question is how can we better do that? And the easy answer is via technology, right? The moment you have a remote employee or a remote team or a virtual environment is the time that you've got technology to help you enable the previous things that you did. So if previously you had job descriptions or a desk manual or checklists, remote environments, you may just have a video conference or a document sharing or a screen sharing session to otherwise provide clarity or provide specificity or some Q&A, right, that you no longer had when you were just, being available to the employee, right down the hall, right? So we might have some digital whiteboarding going on, right? So if previously we used a meeting environment to talk about, who was in charge of, the first 3 steps in a process, and then who would receive the baton, figuratively speaking, right? And to handle the next 7 steps in the process. Maybe in a remote environment, we use digital whiteboarding to talk about how these handoffs are expected and who is now going to be downstream or upstream that the employee is going to need to speak with in order to, get clarity on the task at hand or the data that now has to be managed, in the downstream processes. So you'd really want to use technology to help enable the same types of conversations, but now in a remote way. And clearly, the moment we become virtual or the moment we become remote, so we're now separated from our teams, in my personal opinion, is we need to have more of these types of conversations. We have lost our ability, the moment we become remote, we have lost our ability to just pop our head into someone's workstation or to make ourselves available with this open door policy or this open door philosophy in a physical setting. We lose that the moment we go remote. And so that being said, we are going to need to have more frequent conversations about what task is being delegated or who should be doing what part of that process and why these things are being delegated to so-and-so and not the previous people or whatever the case may be. I believe that open and transparent and consistent communications need to happen more often in a remote setting than they do in a physical setting. So there's a question here from the audience. When should a supervisor lay out expectations? I may have inadvertently just answered that question. Do it early, do it often, do it consistently, and do it in a transparent manner. But I think perhaps maybe the more directed question is there a specific time? And I don't know if I can answer that. I think it would depend. If it's a brand spanking new employee and this is part of their onboarding, then I would do this on a set schedule, right? So brand spanking new employee, lots of questions are likely to pop up about who does that, Why do we do that? What exactly should I be doing in this moment, right? Because they haven't built that intuition and they haven't had that expertise, that time, their butt in the seat, so to speak, to build that expertise about when these things happen. So you might want to have a set schedule, 2 or 3 times a week, to proactively, specifically talk about what is being delegated and who is doing that work, and why that needs to be done at a certain time, and so on and so forth, right? If it's a more seasoned or a more tenured employee who probably already knows the who does this, what needs to be done, why it needs to be done, then perhaps when you go remote, you start off with a pretty frequent schedule, but then you back off as people's intuition and their cadence begins to take on a life of its own. All right. So the next step in the process, the performance management process, is the standards, the performance standards. And previous to you having a remote environment or a remote employee or a team of employees, previously I would have told you to identify with your employees what success looks like, right? What does it sound like? What does it feel like from a customer's perspective, internal customer or external customer? If there was a fly on the wall during a task delivery or during a customer or a client engagement, what might that sound like? What are some things that we're likely to see, right, in a successful delivery of that product or a delivery of that task or an execution of that task? That's what I would have had you do prior to a remote environment. I would have asked you things about what are the benchmarks, right? So productivity benchmarks or activity benchmarks. What are the key performance indicators that would otherwise prove that an employee is meeting your standard, right? Are there industry standards or customer expectations that would drive what success looks like? Are there team expectations, right? Has the team sort of committed to a protocol or to a standard of work or a standard of behavior, right? Has the employer committed organization-wide? Has the supervisor expected a standard for his or her team, right? These are things that prior to remote work, I'm hopeful that every supervisor and manager on the webinar today would have already identified and otherwise articulated to their staff, right? So the moment we go remote, nothing changes, right? Because if the work had to be done prior to remote work at a certain standard, then why is it that the standard would change once remote work came into play? It's a trick question, folks. It doesn't. The standards of what success looks like prior to remote work are exactly the same when remote work is involved. Now, the kicker here, just so you know, is supervisors and managers, pay attention here. Prior to remote work, you might have had a sense that your direct observation could prove, or otherwise, that the standard was being met, right? So now that remote work is in play, now you're worried. You're worried that the standard will not be met. And if we're really honest with ourselves, I think that's really the only difference, is prior to remote work, you had an opportunity to be that fly on the wall, right? To see if the standard was being met. But the standard itself has not changed. It's just the way you observe or you monitor if that standard is being met has changed, right? So as a recap on this, and again, it's a total trick. I baited you into this. Your standards of what success looks like prior to remote work are the same, even though the work is now being done someplace else, all right? What has changed is your engagement, your communication about that type of work. Prior to remote work, you probably talked about standards maybe in a staff meeting, or maybe in a project meeting, or maybe when you got a new client, right? As a gentle reminder that here are your client's expectations and here are your expectations. Or perhaps prior to remote work as a supervisor, you only ever addressed your standards when they weren't being met, right? So they were part and parcel with a performance improvement plan, or a, hey, let's just talk about this. I've noticed a trend and I'm not too happy, or whatever. Maybe they were triggered by those types of conversations. I got to tell you, once you're in a remote work situation, that can't be the only time that you talk about performance standards. Your expectations on standards, your customers' expectations, your organization's expectations, both for behavior standards as well as technical standards. Those types of meetings or otherwise conversations with your employees, they have to happen on a more consistent and transparent and reliable and frequent basis the moment you go remote. And that is because if the only time you talk about performance standards is when things go wrong with a remote employee, then you can imagine how that remote employee will start to feel about his or her relationship with you. Right? But if you talk about performance standards in an open and general way more consistently once you're remote, both for positive and for negative and for total neutral, right? Hey, here are our customer expectations. Here is what we expect, given our new OSHA standard, or given our new this, or given our new that. If that's fairly neutral and it's happening frequently and consistently, then you're not wearing on or otherwise risking damaging that relationship or that perception of that relationship with your remote employees. All right, so there's two questions that came in, so bear with me here. Of course, my phone went dead. Marshall and I are communicating via phone today. So what is a good frequency for supervisors to communicate with his or her remote employee? That's a really, really good question. I would say it would depend, right? For new employees, that frequency should probably be daily, because for a new employee, think about it, for that honeymoon period, as a supervisor, you'd probably be dropping in on them in their cubicle or in their workstation, or wherever they were working. You'd probably be dropping in on them at least once a day to check in. Hey, you need anything? Oh, do you have questions about that? How can I help you? Right? So maybe make it daily for fairly new employees, or employees who are struggling with a new task or a new role. Because remember, it's not just once you go remote, work gets bundled differently, right? And perhaps to make more efficient your human resources, perhaps you've redirected some tasks or some duties to people so they can better do them at home, in a bundling situation for time management purposes. So if you have someone that has a new task or a new duty that he or she is struggling with, obviously that frequency is going to have to go up. But if you have an employee who's fairly tenured and fairly comfortable and fairly self-directed, then I would say that frequency does not have to be once a day or even, every other day. Maybe it could be twice a week at most, right? I think the bigger issue here is how often should you engage with your employees, period, right? And I think the moment you have a remote situation is the need to hop on the phone or hop into that virtual environment more often than just being available down the hall, right? Because there's a sense of trust and a sense of security there when I know that my boss is right down the hall if I need him. But if I'm a remote employee, I don't know that. I don't know if they're going to be answering the phone or available in a virtual environment, right? So my sense of trust for that now is wavering. Another question that came in is, what are some tools that help supervisors monitor a remote work? Don't jump ahead. That's a question that's going to be answered, but not quite yet. So just breathe in, breathe out. We're going to get there. All right. So look at that. I don't lie, right? Monitoring and measuring. And don't be turned off by this guy. I think this guy's probably pretty handsome or otherwise pleasant to look at, but not in this little face that he's making right now. So he kind of bothers me here. But in a non-remote setting, right? So on any given physical work environment setting, we had, as supervisors and managers, a variety of tools available to us, right? We could directly observe. We could, park ourselves, park our butts in the seats and observe and sit into a client meeting or to a project meeting or whatever. We could poke our head in, so to speak, right? We could listen in for call centers, that happens all the time. Or we could even listen in to teleconferences, that are not, call center-esque. We could rely on peer or customer feedback. We could rely on audits or quantity, productivity tools, or quality measurements like an audit or a system check or something like that. We could rely on project management tools, such as Basecamp, to check in for activities, and to not only using that to delegate activities to people, but then to follow through online, right? Basecamp is an online tool to follow through online to make sure that they've done it. Or we would get alerted from accountability tools such as that a task is overdue, right? And we could use that tool to check in and say, hey, is there a good reason why that activity has not yet been done? Do we need to push that deadline back, and so on and so forth? We had the ability to have meetings and follow-ups and post-project, post-project lessons learned meetings, and so on and so forth. We had so many tools available to us to help us monitor and or measure our staff's work when we were all physically here in the building, right? I could walk down the hall, you could poke your head in, we could all be together, and so on and so forth, right? But the moment we go remote, a lot of supervisors think, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? How am I going to monitor my staff's success? And I got to tell you, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. I think that trust is going to be somewhat problematic, because while in a physical setting, I can walk around, right? Oh, supervisor's in the room, right? Everybody better behave. Everybody better look productive. Everybody better get busy. Or if my manager or my supervisor could just pop in and sit into a client meeting, we better make sure that we're making good use of this time, and so on and so forth, right? Really, those are the only things that have gone away in a remote setting. But if we have trust that is lacking, or if we don't have trust at all, I can imagine that remote work is very, very scary for supervisors and managers. And so the question is, what are some tools to help supervisors monitor remote workers? I suppose there are a lot of tools available that are not listed here on the slide, because these are tools available, and most of them are online, or that could very easily become online. But we also have things like time tracking, where you're forcing people to log in, right? I am working at this time, right? And they're now tracking their time in 50-minute increments to prove to you that they're being productive at home, to prove to you that they're not on Netflix, or to prove to you that they're not taking care of their child, or out in the sun, I don't know, gardening, or whatever the case may be. And I would suggest, and you may not like to hear this, but I would suggest that if you're worried about that, then you've got bigger issues than just remote work problems, right? What you have is you have trust issues. And if you have staff that are not results focused, that are not self-disciplined, and that are not focusing in on what's important, why they're getting paid, then I'm going to, go out on a limb here, and I'm going to say that is a bigger performance management problem. But I'm also going to go out on a limb here and say that I doubt they were perfect when they were physically in your office. They may have just been very, very good and mastered the art of looking busy. right? And I think that there's some harsh truths here once we go remote. And there's a increase right now in all of these time tracking tools, right? So you can make sure your remote employees are productive. And I would say that the same tools yesterday should be used today. Now, trust and your check-ins with them and your monitoring them, or at least communicating to them about how they're being monitored, I would say that perhaps changes once we go remotely, right? Because when we were physically located, then maybe we only talked about poor performance, right? When they're not meeting your standards is poor performance. Maybe we only talked about that when we noticed it, right? Or when an audit or a report or a project management or accountability tool such as Basecamp or other online project management tools, maybe we only checked in when things looked problematic, right? When we're remote monitoring or remote measuring our staff's performance, I would suggest that should become transparent and consistent, right? Everybody should be treated similarly. Everybody should get both the good and the bad from you, the supervisor. But I would suggest that those things are only when necessary, right? So for instance, so if we're in person, right, and we are doing 10% audits for quality checks or for thorough documentation, or we're doing a post-project meeting, right? That's how we're checking our staff's performance against our customers' expectations or our industry's expectations, right? If we're doing that now, we should be doing that remotely, and we should only be doing that when it's necessary, right? So if we didn't constantly watch over our staff and constantly ask them, hey, did you do this? Hey, what about this? Hey, I noticed this, went wrong or whatever. If we weren't doing that on a constant basis in person, we shouldn't be doing it remotely, right? And again, that is because the moment you go to a remote situation is the moment that you've got relationships that are dependent upon that engagement, and they start to get defined by that engagement. And so if we're only engaging with our staff when we're, like when we've got our magnifying glass on them, that is not developing the type of trusting relationship that we would like to kind of build with all of our staff. All right. And so when we have job expectations clearly identified and consistently articulated, and we know what those standards of performance look like, both behavioral standard as well as technical standards of performance look like, and we have articulated them to our staff in a very consistent and transparent and timely manner, and we know how we're going to monitor our staff's performance to otherwise get proof that our staff are meeting the standard. Only when we have those things in place are we able to identify whether our staff in a remote setting are doing the limbo, meaning that they're coming in under our standard, or they're doing the high jump, meaning that they're coming in over our standard, right? But until those first three things are clearly identified and clearly and consistently articulated, we won't really know about this limbo versus high jump issue. But that's another story for another time. Next week, I will be back to specifically unpack that options bucket in the process, and then specifically talk about recognition and feedback in a remote manner, right? And it all has to do with what we notice when we're monitoring and measuring. Are our staff playing the limbo, or are they engaging in the high jump? All right, so that is next. I have one more question that I see has plugged in, so bear with me here. You bring up a good point about trust. How does a supervisor build trust in a remote work environment when the employee is suspicious of the supervisor? Boy, that is a loaded question, because what you're talking about is not building trust. What you're really asking about is repairing a relationship. And that is, there's a lot to unpack there. My very, very quick advice when a supervisor finds him or herself in a situation where they need to repair a trustful relationship with an employee is begin to communicate more. I believe that communication and trust go hand in hand. I don't know which comes first, right? The chicken or the egg argument. I think you need really good communication to build trust, but you also need really good trust in order to communicate well. And so when one is lacking, I've always offered the advice, do the other more, right? So if communication is lacking, then try to prove that they can trust you, right? That increases communication. But if trust is lacking, then try to engage more with them, right? Try to communicate more to build that trust. And that's obviously reciprocal as well. If they don't trust you, it's quite likely that you don't trust them. And so communicating with them more might help enable you to trust them more as well. So I'm hopeful that that answered your question. And we're out of time, so I'm going to go ahead and get ready to say my goodbyes here. If you'd like to share this webinar via a recording with your network, please do. You'll find it on our website fairly shortly. It takes me about 5 minutes to get that all wrapped up. If you have ideas for future programming, please feel free to email them to info@thestrivegroup.com. If you have ideas for future programming and you also have ideas for who might be perfect to be a guest for that, I'd love for you to let me know that as well, because I will reach out to them and ask them if they'd like to be a guest. So you're not just, looking at me every single day or every single week. That's got to get boring, right? It's got to get boring for you. I just know it. But anyway, here's some information about me and the Strive groups specifically. These are the services that we offer. I hope that if you or your business ever have a need, you'll reach out to me and ask us. I'd happy to meet with you to figure out how we can help. And other than that, I'll go ahead and say my goodbyes. I bid you a hearty farewell on this Thursday. Stay safe, stay physically distant, wash your hands, all that good stuff. All right? Thanks for joining us.